All right, AP, here we are with our lecture on the Enlightenment. And so this is kind of where we came out of the scientific revolution. And you can see how there are this aspects where they kind of blend the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment kind of mixed together in that you have some of these scientists are dabbling in not just science, but in philosophy. For example, Descartes with his concepts of deductive logic also moved into the ideas of philosophy with the idea of I think therefore I am, the idea that you are a conscious thinking human being means you are real, that you have existence, that you are sentient. um, Newton's ideas of natural laws will be able to transpose into the ideas of natural rights. So, and the ideas of deism are going to cross over. So, like we said, you look at the scientific revolution and you can almost dovetail it into the Enlightenment. And remember, neither one of these time periods are actually real. As these are things that historians created the concepts of, mostly in the 1830s. All right. So, the origins of the Enlightenment, one, we see it with what came out of the scientific revolution with the ideas of deism. This idea that God, the supreme being, that basically was the clockmaker, that God made it, created it, and sent it forth. And that God was then part of the ideas of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, and that they came from Him, that He granted you consciousness, which allowed this to take place. And so, like we said with science, wherever this science stopped, then that's where God fell, if that makes sense, with the deist. And Newton was one of the best examples of a deist. Voltaire would be a bit of a deist. All right. So pantheism basically said that God and nature are one and the same. So this, worked its way into like the ideas of Protestantism and Catholicism, that trees and birds and everything is God personified. So, and then you could reveal God's mysteries by using science and philosophy to discover these things. So that's pantheism. We're also going to see the ideas of rationalism. So those ideas that we saw with the scientific revolution in using deductive and inductive logic and experiments, that's where this is going to fit into the Enlightenment, that you can apply the same concepts to man and society. We're going to see cosmology, the idea that concept of man is existence, that he's real. Secularism, we're going to move away from religion and more towards science. We're going to see the scientific method applied, mathematic analysis, experimentation, inductive reasoning. Altruism, the idea that the greater good for the greater number is important, being altruistic. We're going to see this later also in the next semester when we're talking about the beginnings of socialism and the ideas of the revolutionary ideas of the 1830s. Bentham, Jeremiah Bentham. We're also going to see the ideas of tolerance, that no more burning your neighbor because you think they're a witch or because they've got a wart or because they've got a birthmark or something like that. Okay. Optimism and self-confidence, that man is basically instinctively a good thing, right? That you are inherently good. And you're going to see this in many of the philosophers, that if given the right opportunity, you will do the right thing and do what is best for everyone. And this idea that we as a society, then, if we're working for the betterment of each other, society then would do the same. Freedom of thought, expression, of religion, the ideas of liberty. This is the counterpart. Just like you're going to see everything now as a reaction to, like we said, that Baroque was a reaction, that was Rococo was a reaction to Baroque in art. And then neoclassical is a reaction to Rococo, that idea of the wealth and splendor. And now you're going to see the idea that you're going to see a pushback against the political ideas as well. We saw that a little bit in England, but England had already had that seed in it. It wasn't like all of a sudden these ideas of philosophy led to absolutism being a bad thing. England had already had that root with Magna Carta, right? But now we're going to see in other places where you're going to see this idea that absolutism is a bad thing. All right. And there's a pushback, the liberty of all men. And of course, the idea of spreading this knowledge to everyone, not just the upper class, but to every single class and every single individual. You also see legal reforms, the ideas of justice, kindness, charity, that basically you shouldn't torture people, throw them in jail, or they should be allowed to have due process of law from this. You should see constitutionalism, that government should be made of the people with written constitutions listing specific rights that individuals have. We saw the beginning of this with England, with the English Bill of Rights. But remember, the Enlightenment had not started yet. So that's a revolutionary idea that other Europeans are going to look at and say, look, England has this. The thing, though, you have to understand is England, this has been a long process. The English Bill of Rights is written in the 1680s, right? The Magna Carta was 1215. That means there's almost 400 years, over 400 years to get to that constitutional, and it's still not a constitutional monarchy at that point, even with the English Bill of Rights. So you're seeing a long haul still coming that some people really didn't understand, especially the French. All right. You're going to see the idea of cosmopolitanism, this idea of urban ideas and a mixing of ideas in these urban areas. And so what you're talking about here is the great debate of what it's a challenge between is that rationalism and empiricism and tolerance and skepticism, where you're going to challenge ideas, and this idea that God is more hands off, that God's in nature and God's around us, but he's not this all judging deity that sets you, on paths by judging people. All right. Versus the old nostalgic ideas and the ideas of organized religion and Aristotle's ideas and this emotional concepts that came out of religion. So that's the struggle we're talking about. One thing that's going to really drive the Enlightenment is print. Is that Gutenberg's printing press by now you're going to see him spread throughout every urban area you can possibly think of. And the increased number of books and pamphlets are going to increase the literacy rate, which then creates this new concept, all right, of public opinion. That by creating these works, by creating books and pamphlets and things like that, you can then influence the way people think and therefore control how they think or set them on a path to what you want them to think. And that led to censorship by many governments or control of print media, which then again caused a desire for more rights and a pushback. You're also going to see many people become extremely wealthy, like Voltaire, by printing their books, which is a new concept of the author becoming increasingly. Now, you're also going to see an increase of this even more in the 1800s as printing presses are given steam power. One of the biggest writers to spread the ideas that's important during this time period is Diderot. This is Diderot. Diderot is important because he and D'Alembert is an example of the encyclopedia. They are the editors who are going to collect all these works of many philosophers, Voltaire, Rousseau, Locke, Hobbes. They put them all together. Also, this is excerpts of science. So just like Wikipedia is today, or the old-fashioned hardbound encyclopedias, these basically contain knowledge which then could be spread throughout Europe, which is going to help increase education and increase secularism. So this is an example of Diderot's encyclopedia. Now, these were actually almost burned in France, but this is another example of Madame Pompadour's influence, that she kept Louis XV from burning these. So you're going to see examples of science, different inventions, different ways. This is a canal system. Here's I believe this is smelting of metals. Here we have how to build a chair, the parts of a chair. This is human anatomy. This is your nervous system. This is, I believe, your reproductive organs, skeletal frame, muscle, internal organs, stomach. This is the fat around your stomach. There's your bone. And this again is the spread of now again, this is the kind of thing that could show up on an AP test. Okay. And so there's a whole lot here, and we'll talk about this slide probably in class. But here's what I want to make sure we point out to you, just in case we don't. Notice where the highest concentrations of encyclopedias are. Okay, folks, think about what's going to happen where all these little dots are. See this? See all this? Right? Think about it. In the 1780s, what event is going to happen in Paris? Do you think there might be a connection between the amount of information that's being spread and what's going to happen in Paris and to Louis XVI? Notice there's also not as many encyclopedias over here in England, but yet it's an enlightened area. Now, here's where AP, this is the one question, right? This is the one question here. The other question on an SAQ or on a multiple choice test, notice where they're not. Now, England, Dublin, they've got a few here, but now look at this, right? There's only in Madrid, and there's only maybe 1 to 10, right? At least there's 11 to 50 here, but there's only 1 to 10, which means it's probably in the control of the king. Warsaw, maybe 11 to 50, which means there's some educated people here in Poland. Look at Russia. These belong to the monarch. These are Catherine the Great's copies. Look at the Ottoman Empire. Nothing. Think about how this all fits. Think about how this fits into what we've talked about, the Ottoman Empire, about the hamster in the wheel, or Russia and how it's falling farther and farther behind, right? Could that be something that you may want to think about the fact the lack of encyclopedias here are a sign of something, a sign of backwardness, right? Of lack of control or strong monarchs preventing those things from happening. Here, this is a powder keg waiting to go off. Right here. Notice here, not as many. Is that a pushback by the church and secularism against secularism? Think about that, people. Think about that. All right. So there, like I said, increased amount of reading. This is your literacy rates, which this is going to help go hand in hand with what we're going to see with the Industrial Revolution and the beginning of the scientific, or the end, well, the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and the beginning of England as a major economic power. These are the major works and books: Newton, Locke, Voltaire, Montesquieu. These are things you should read excerpts from. We are going to read excerpts from this one, this one, this one, this one. So yeah, you're going to see some of, oh, and this part, well, no, this one. Okay. One way that also spreading the ideas was not just through books, but from the salons, which we will talk about when we talk about coffee. Is that imagine everyone sitting around in fancy dresses, drinking coffee and tea, and having little sandwiches while talking about the rights of man, right? That's what these were. These were held in wealthy areas, just as much as the coffee house in England was also a way of spreading ideas. So in England, it was the coffee house. You would go into the coffee house, and that was kind of fed by the Puritans to a degree since they got rid of the liquor. But then once you get into the coffee houses, this is where science and math and philosophies and economics, all those things flowed through the coffee houses. Here in France, the coffee in the form of the salon in these fancy houses help feed the ideas and spread. So you'd sit around, eat your little sandwiches, drink your little cup of coffee, and listen to Voltaire read his newest treatise. So that's how it worked. This is Madame Goffrin's salon. These are some of the major players. Madame Necker will become very important. Madame Pompadour was on. Madame Goffrin. These are all very, and this is one of the ways that women influenced the Enlightenment. That by holding the salons, they then allowed the spread of ideas. So if you're wanting a way women influenced the Enlightenment, this is one of them. For England, the impact of the Enlightenment, you're going to see freedom of speech and press coming, a limited monarchy eventually, the spread of courts and protected citizens. So basically, after you get through this, the Glorious Revolution and the English Bill of Rights, you're going to see a growth of the Enlightenment from that point. That England's been moving further and further away from a monarchy uh, solely to a constitutional monarchy, basically one law at a time. You're also going to see increased religious tolerance for Unitarians and Roman Catholics. And this is where a couple of the philosophers come in. Hobbes, in his book Leviathan, we've talked a bit about this. Hobbes is influenced by the Civil War. He saw what was happening in the Civil War and the death of the king, and he saw that man is naturally evil, and that therefore you're most likely to hurt each other, and the state was the only thing that could possibly hold you back. But he says you have natural rights, that humans do have rights, but you choose to give up some of those rights for security. Now, in this time period, you'd say he's supporting the ideas of an absolute monarch, but he's also supporting the concept of laws drafted by men. Any law is basically you choosing to give up a right you have for security or for to maintain social order. So that's where Hobbes fits in. He's your laws. Even though it sounds like he's supporting absolutism, he's actually supporting something else. Locke basically says that you are naturally good. But remember, he survived the Glorious Revolution. He's advisors to William and Mary. So he sees you as good people because he thinks that every revolution ends that way. And then so in his second treaty as a government, he's basically saying the idea that government is a necessity and responsibility, but that basically you are that protecting the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that basically, if a government does not do those things, you have a right to overthrow it. He also, in the Essays Concerning Human Understanding, describes this idea that that basically humans are born as blank slates, and that whatever you put into them is what they become. And so that's why he's supporting the ideas of education and that you think about that's how you're taught to a degree. We pump in things to make you what you are. So that's the tabula rasa. That's what they call it, the blank slate. You probably learned about that in psychology if you're taking psychology. Okay. So these philosophers, besides the ones we saw in England, they're going to favor change, and they're going to see the ideas of universities and coffee houses are the ones that are going to spread these ideas. All right. Voltaire, Voltaire is like character. We'll talk about him a little bit in class. But Voltaire, he gets thrown in prison like basically everywhere he goes. He's the guy, he's that friend of yours that somehow always causes trouble. You love having him around, but he's got at some point he's going to tick someone off. And that's what he does. He thinks that England is basically one of the best systems ever. He pushes for religious tolerance, freedom of speech, um, freedom of the press. He's very much one that everyone and anyone should be able to express themselves and worship however they want. He's for religious tolerance. In Candide, he basically pokes fun at organized religion and talking about how they basically promise things that they can't do, and that he this idea that they can torture people in the name of the Lord. He's like, this is not right. All right. So he basically is trying to push this idea. And this is where you'd see our First Amendment rights: freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of religion. Voltaire basically got to the point where nobody really liked him. He worked, he met Catherine the Great. He was a friend of Frederick the Great. He wrote multiple books, but he would end up making people angry. He would push for religious tolerances or things like that, or freedoms, and then he'd be either kicked out or thrown in prison for a short period of time. Eventually, he got the idea of opening up his own inn, and he opened a place so therefore people would come to him. So and probably the most important thing, these are some of the great quotes of Voltaire. Um, Every man is guilty of all the good he didn't do. I like that one. The danger is to be right when when the government is wrong. That's a good one. All right. God is a comedian playing to an audience too afraid to laugh. you come on, look around you, folks. Does that not make sense? My favorite one, I believe, is this one. I may not agree with what you have to say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. That right there sums up the concepts of Voltaire. I like Voltaire. I don't know if I'd want to spend a lot of time with Voltaire, but I like Voltaire because this sums up the Enlightenment right there. That this idea, okay? Kant, well, you'll really like Kant if you like transcendentalism, because that's that found in his book Metaphysical Foundations of Natural Science. He basically lays the groundwork to what we would call transcendentalism, right? This idea, like it says here, some things are known by methods, others are empirical, and the belief in the existence of the non-rational way to understand things. This is where this idea of transcending the sensory experience, this is transcendentalism that you loved oh so much before in English class. In religion, there's basically they're going to challenge this idea of the church, right? And especially you're going to see this going into France. This idea that the church is not paying taxes, that it's in complicit with the rulers, and that they censor ideas that counter their ideas. You're going to see the ideas of deism we talked about already. John Toland, good example of these. We're going to see Locke pushing for religious tolerance. Voltaire, like we said in Treaties of Tolerance, right? And by the way, they really are not happy with Islam either, not just the Catholic Church. Um, we're also see this idea. David Hume is going to be pushing the ideas of basically enlighten of the ideas of atheism. That's what Hume's going to be pushing. That basically, where's the evidence? Show me the evidence, right? Uh, and then we said that's Hume, right? That's that borderline of the ideas of atheism. We're going to see this in the Jewish faith. Spinoza and his work Ethics is basically trying to apply, think of it kind of like a Lutheran concept to Judaism, right? That he's trying to reform the Jewish faith, and he gets excommunicated for doing that because he basically called Jews and Christians to use reason and religious matters, which is yeah, that didn't go over well with the rabbis. Mendelssohn, the idea he basically argued differently than Spinoza, but he tried to combine rationalism and loyalty to Judaism. So you're going to see a lot of criticism, though, of Islam. Voltaire basically saw it as fanaticism, that this idea of how you let religion cover every part of your government and every part of your society. He saw that as way too radical. Montesquieu, same thing, right? That he sees it as a political despotism, that you're allowing religion and the government to mix, basically limits individual rights. There are some positive ones, Gibbon, right? Montague, but yeah, overall, many of them were not favorable. Beccaria, the ideas of criminal reform, that's where your Eighth Amendment comes from. The ideas, and also part of your Fourth and Fifth Amendments, the idea that basically saying that you can't just throw people in jail and you can't just put thumb screws to them. That's your Eighth Amendment. We're going to see some economic changes with Quisney. The idea of basically moving away from mercantilism is what you're going to see. And the biggest move away from mercantilism is Adam Smith, who basically puts in the ideas of what we call capitalism, in that it gives the power to the individual away from mercantilism, away from the state controlling economics to the individual. If I can convince people to buy my product, right? That's the way it is. That he saw society moving from this hunter-gathering, pastoral to agricultural to commercial, which is the industrial idea. Now, granted, he's coming in at the very beginning of the proto-industrial revolution. He sees this more as a trade-based idea. But laissez-faire, basically the principles are one, laissez-faire, government hands off, no more mercantilism, picking who wins, who loses, no more tariffs, no more, saying these guilds get support and other ones don't. Two, he thinks the system should be governed by the invisible hand, right? That basically whatever the individuals want to buy in society, that's what governs the market. If you can sell a rock in a box as a pet and people will buy it, by God, sell it. He believes in supply and demand. That basically what sets the price of something is the demand for that thing and the supply of it. And he believes in the concept of profit and competition, that should not be governed by society as far as mercantilism was by the state. It should be governed by what people buy and what you're willing to sell. So that's a radical idea, moving away from mercantilism. And that was Wealth of Nations, his book. You're also going to see Montesquieu in reforming the government, the idea of the spirit of laws, that government should be representative of the people, and that power should be divided between the branches of government, the separation of powers. And you saw that already forming in England. And that's why this is the examples. Baron Montesquieu talks about this idea of separating powers. In England, you had the king was the head of state and the executive, and then Parliament was the legislature. And eventually, they're going to split that even further, that the king is the head of state, but the chief executive is the prime minister. Remember Walpole? And then the power then is divided in the cabinet, which then is the executive branch. And then Parliament, the House of Commons, would be the legislative branch. And then the courts, besides that, would check on all of these. So you're separating at the power, which allows less corruption. See how that works? Rousseau, all right. Rousseau, he can cause a whole lot of problems here. All right. Jean Jacques Rousseau and his idea of social contract. All right. Basically, what Rousseau says, and we'll talk about this in class from the documents, but Rousseau's basically telling you that it should be the will of the people, right? That basically society is governed by the majority, right? So that the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or of the one. And so if we as a group want this to be, then this is what it should be. Well, that's a great idea, right? This idea of the government of the people, by the people, for the people, right? That's the idea. The community will. That is literally the first line of our Constitution. We the people. However, think about what happens if the will of the people is hijacked by someone circa like 1933 Germany. Think about that. Or if the will of the people is hijacked by something like Soviet Russia, 1940s, right? That's what we're talking about, is that this can be a force of good, being the will of the people. It also could be a thing of bad, in that the will of the people. Okay. So, and this is going to then influence American philosophers like Thomas Jefferson. You see Locke literally in the Declaration of Independence. Ben Franklin, the will of the, or John Adams too, will of the people, right? They push back against the idea of too much power at the executive branch or the idea of a Bill of Rights. Okay. So we're going to see people that are obviously not going to be happy with this, right? That human beings deserve have a moral political idea, and you're going to see some questioning of how they treat native populations, and how they disrespect different cultures. However, for women, you're going to see a it's like we talked about the scientific revolution. Some people believed in equality of the sexes, like Montesquieu. Rousseau believed in the ideas of separate spheres, right? That believed, so Montesquieu thinks that everyone should be equal, right? But in Rousseau's ideas, he felt that women should be subordinate to men because he thought that men had their own sphere that they moved in, that men are good at governing and men are good at war and men are good at industry. And women are really good at the ideas of how to care for the home and for the children. And so that they should stay in their sphere because they're really, really good at that. And men are really good at this. You also have to point out that Rousseau also believed in basically the Montessori approach. He thought that if children want to study piano, then they should study piano. They don't need to study. Why are you teaching them math if they're never going to use it? All right. Or if they're excited by something, they're going to be really good at it. He believed in total freedom of the individual, unlike Locke, who says pump it all into them and they'll become a real person. So Rousseau, now, you have to remember, though, also that Rousseau basically never married this one woman that he was living with, and they had multiple children that they gave up to the foundling hospitals that they never raised, orphanages. So I don't know how much you'd put into Rousseau, but you can obviously tell that Rousseau is not going to be one really pushing for women's rights. An example of a woman really pushing for women's rights was Mary Wollstonecraft, who basically argued that women should be able to do everything that men do, and that by giving women an education equal to that of men would allow them then to pursue anything they want to do. So there were women pushing for it, but there are also men pushing back against it. So before we move any further, all right, the next lecture will talk about how those ideas then influence the monarchs of the time. We can see how this is going to cause pressure for trade. Capitalism and that pushback against mercantilism, that's going to help trigger the American Revolution. The ideas of individual rights, the ideas of liberty and justice, and the idea that individuals should run their own government, that's going to cause the French Revolution. But the lack of all these things are going to push Russia and other places even further behind. But how did it infect in these absolute monarchs in Europe? Obviously, some of them, like Louis, is going to push back against these ideas, but others are going to embrace them and use them to try to expand their power and the prestige of their state. So, in the next lecture, we'll talk about enlightened absolute monarchs. So, see you then.